I hope you enjoy this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. I also want to thank the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being for sponsoring this course, and you can check that school out at divineinfinitebeing.com. Now we've gone over the basics of Plato's cosmology, and in the next section of the class we're going to discuss how Plato's cosmology was fused with Christianity in the Middle Ages to become the predominant paradigm of Europe throughout the Middle Ages. The intermediary phase of history that led from the ancient world, where Plato was discussed, to the fusion of Plato and Christianity is Neoplatonism. And the Neoplatonists didn't consider themselves Neoplatonists. They considered, or at least the first Neoplatonist, Plotinus, just considered himself a student of Plato, and he was trying to give his own explanation of what he believed Plato meant openly and secretly. So as this intermediary phase, I'm just going to briefly go over the main actors in the schools of Neoplatonism, and I'll read from this text, the Corpus Hermeticum, and then I'll read from a scholar who writes about the influence of one of these Neoplatonists, Iamblichus. So the first Neoplatonist was Plotinus, 204 to 270 Common Era. His student was Porphyry, 234 to 305. His student was Iamblichus, 245 to 325. Julian the Apostate was an emperor of Rome. He was the nephew of Constantine I, or Constantine the Great, who set the stage to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Julian the Apostate, influenced by Iamblichus, was trying to bring Iamblichus's Platonic interpretation of the pagan gods, the Greco-Roman pagan gods, back into predominance in the Roman Empire. He ultimately failed, as we'll see. After Julian the Apostate came Proclus, a scholar who was a Neoplatonic scholar influenced by Iamblichus. Pseudo-Dionysius was an anonymous scholar who was writing under the pseudonym of Dionysius, who was a saint converted by St. Paul. Now, Pseudo-Dionysius focused on one of the lessons Iamblichus talked about, which are the hierarchy of angelic beings emanating from the outermost sphere of the cosmos, and that was eventually incorporated into the Catholic Church. So, let me just read this quote here from the Corpus Hermeticum, which was a series of Greek writings that were purported to have been written by Hermes Trismegistus, who was a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. It was presented as if it had been written in the ancient past in Egypt. It was greatly influenced by Plato's philosophy, and especially the Timaeus, where Plato talks about the ancient knowledge of the Egyptians. So this is written in chapter 8, verse 3 of the Corpus Hermeticum, and it is Hermes talking to his son Tot and explaining to him why nothing dies in the material world. So I'll just read a quote from the Corpus Hermeticum. "And of the matter stored beneath it," meaning the cosmos, "the Father made of it a universal body, and packing it together, made it spherical, wrapping it round the life, a sphere which is immortal in itself, and that doth make materiality eternal." So in this chapter of the Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes is explaining that nothing dies, everything is eternal. Things change, but if you interpret change to mean things die, then you're incorrect. And how is it that things don't die? Because the universe, the cosmos, created by God the Father, is encompassed by some sphere which makes all matter eternal. That is the main focus of this whole class. As we saw in the Timaeus, Plato called that outermost sphere of the universe the mother substance, and that's also where all of the absolute ideas that are contained in the idea of the good exist, according to the Timaeus and other Platonic dialogues. So here we see it in this other book of mystical writings, which were influential on the Neoplatonists, especially Iamblichus. So this next quote comes from a scholar, Gregory Shaw, writing about Iamblichus. So Iamblichus is different than Plotinus and Porphyry. in the respect that he said not only divine contemplation of the idea of the good, it's not only this kind of a intellectual meditation on the source of all being that can liberate the soul from the material illusion, but you also have to engage in certain ritual acts and meditation on certain geometrical symbols. Because the idea of the good, God, the Father, is beyond being. As the source of being, God is beyond being, and God is therefore also beyond reason. Reason alone cannot reunite us with God. So in addition to theology, which is the study of the logos, of the philosophical concepts of God, you also need what Iamblichus called theurgy, or God work. And that's these ritual acts which help the soul resonate with the ultimate truth. And here's what Gregory Shaw says: the foreknowledge, prognosis, given in divination was not knowledge of particular events. It was, rather, an immediate knowledge, possessing in a primary way, protos, things that happen serially in time. Like the noesis of the gods, the primary knowing was unreflective and therefore was not knowledge in a discursive sense. It lifted the soul from particular knowing to the level of the gods, where all events, past and future, were simultaneously contained. Theurgic prognosis was literally a pro plus gnosis, an ascent to the arche of knowing, and thus to that which precedes knowing. Yet, as the arche of knowledge, prognosis contained all its species, so the information received in the divination, although accurate, was merely incidental to the soul's ascent to the arche. Knowledge of the future was not an essential characteristic of theurgic montiche. Iamblichus says, quote, whenever it is necessary for the soul to exercise virtue, and ignorance of the future contributes to this, the gods conceal the things that will happen in order to make the soul better. So that's from the book Theurgy and the Soul, the Neoplatonism of Iamblichus by Gregory Shaw. Alright, so Plotinus and Porphyry focused on the intellectual contemplation of the idea of the good, which they called the One. Iamblichus said in addition to this intellectual contemplation, you should also engage in theurgy, which includes an understanding of the hierarchy of angelic beings emanating from the One and from this outermost sphere. We see here that part of theurgy includes divination, discovering the future. I'm not an expert on the Neoplatonists by any means. I focused on Plato's dialogues themselves, but from what I have read about them, Iamblichus believed you could do certain ritual acts that could employ these angelic beings in your service. And one of the things that you could get from this union with these angelic beings was knowledge of the future. This is also a part of astrology, which was part of this Neoplatonic tradition. The archetypes are correlated with the positions of the planets, and from that you can interpret how the future may unfold. This divination wasn't intended to give you detailed foreknowledge of specific events unfolding in the material world. Rather, it was to put you in touch with the archetypes from which all of the material events unfold in time. The archetypes contain the past, the present, and future of everything that unfolds from them in the material universe. So theurgy, the ultimate goal, is to reunite the soul with God. It's not to gain power over the material illusion, it's to escape the material illusion. And the way to do that is to focus on the ideas in the mind of God, or out at this outermost sphere of the cosmos. The whole point of this class is that realizing that we are one with the central singularity and the holographic horizon of the cosmos is how we can become a hero performing our heroics for a cosmic God on the universal stage. And I focused on Iamblichus here because he's had more of a ritualistic understanding of how you could serve God, and that was incorporated into the Catholic Church, which ruled over Europe throughout the Middle Ages. And this was Plato's philosophy in actual religious practice throughout the Middle Ages. So with that brief introduction to Neoplatonism, we're now focused on the fusion of Plato and Christianity, especially as presented by St. Augustine. Christianity plus Plato equals Middle Ages, According to T.Z. Levine, for 2,000 years, when Christians thought of God, they envisioned the divided line and the ascent out of the cave through the power of reason and the power of love to Plato's idea of the good. So we've gone over Plato's cosmology in the Timaeus and the Republic and the Phaedrus, and now we're seeing that, especially thanks to St. Augustine, Christianity was interwoven with Plato's cosmology in the Middle Ages. The power of reason and the power of love correspond to Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, which is what this class is based on. We're going over these philosophical concepts to try to zero in on an intuition of God, understood as the omnicentric singularity, so that we can take a Kierkegaardian leap of faith in God, surrender ourselves completely, and perform our heroics on the cosmic stage. That's the goal of this class. So continuing with the slide, according to Richard Tarnas, many early Christian sages considered Plato's philosophy to be a divinely prearranged matrix for the rational explication of the Christian faith. So that's the great single-volume history of Western thought, The Passion of the Western Mind. We saw earlier Friedrich Nietzsche said that in order for people to believe a religion, they have to believe that God gave it and the forefathers lived it. So the psyche equals singularity equation is presaged in Plato's dialogues, and it emerged in the same academic tradition that Plato inaugurated in the curriculum in the Republic, which culminates with opening the eye of the soul to the idea of the good by studying the ascending dimensions of nature and the mathematics that describe them. The first, second, and third dimension, and then the fourth dimension of time, understood as the periodic movement of three-dimensional solids, specifically the movement of the planets, which is astronomy, and the movement of musical instruments, the periodic vibrations of strings and the flutes or whatever musical instrument you use, which is music. Astronomy and music, studying the mathematics that describe them, which studies time, is the last step on the mathematical curriculum leading to the understanding of the idea of the good, which I'm equating with the gravitational singularity. So the point is, we can embrace this equation as the most recent manifestation of the God archetype, because we're equating it with God, and the forefathers did live it in the form of this fusion of Christianity and Platonism. According to Nietzsche, Christianity is Platonism for the people. So the Christian tradition has been interwoven with Plato's cosmology at least since St. Augustine. St. Augustine, architect of Platonic Christianity. So returning again to the Passion of the Western Mind, that supreme light, the true source of reality, shining forth outside Plato's cave of shadows, was now recognized as the light of Christ. Thus Augustine held that the Platonic forms existed within the creative mind of God, and that the ground of reality lay beyond the world of the senses, available only through a radical inward turning of the soul. It was Augustine's formulation of Christian Platonism that was to permeate virtually all of medieval Christian thought in the West. So enthusiastic was the Christian integration of the Greek spirit that Socrates and Plato were frequently regarded as divinely inspired pre-Christian saints, Christians before Christ, as Justin Martyr claimed. So it's easy to see the correlation between Plato's idea of the good and the omnicentric singularity, because Plato described the idea of the good as the infinitely bright source of light in the visible world and the source of truth and intelligence or consciousness itself in the spiritual world. Therefore, it is plausible to suggest that the psyche equals singularity equation is the historical continuation of this Platonic Christian tradition. St. Augustine. So St. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430 AD, identified God with Plato's ultimate idea of the good and described Christ as living eternally with the cosmic mother and spouse of God, specifically at the outermost sphere of the universe. According to Augustine's Platonic interpretation of the biblical Jesus Christ, he is the walking incarnation of all of the eternal ideas of God the Father's creative mind, and is referred to in the first verse of the Gospel of St. John as the Logos, translated as the Word. So that first verse in the Gospel of St. John is, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So the Word is translated from the Greek logos, which is equivalent to the idea of the good and the gravitational singularity, and Jesus Christ is the Logos. So the Trinity in Christian theology, the monotheistic God, is nevertheless a triune God, three gods in one: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. So what St. Augustine describes Jesus Christ as is God the Son, and God the Son exists with God the Father and this cosmic mother, which is the outermost spherical horizon of the cosmos, where all of the ideas that are contained in the idea of the good exist. So the idea of the good exists at each point of the encompassing sphere of the universe, where all of the absolute ideas eternally reside and from where they project the illusion of the three-dimensional world. That is Plato's cosmology, and the parallels with Susskind's holographic string theory cosmology are clear. Continuing with the slide, the Logos, as Augustine interprets it, is equivalent to Plato's idea of the good, which has all of the qualities of the gravitational singularity, an omniscient and omnipresent point of infinite power that creates and structures the cosmos by conserving and projecting each bit of information of which it is made. If the singularity were self-aware, it would very closely conform to Augustine's idea of God. So Leonard Susskind says that the cosmic horizon contains, at each point, every bit of information describing the past, the present, and the future of the universe. Carl Jung experienced the same thing during his near-death experience, and St. Augustine says the same thing in his famous book, The Confessions. St. Augustine's heaven of heaven, eternal intellect at the cosmic horizon. So we'll be turning to St. Augustine's Confessions, which is his autobiography, in which he includes his cosmological speculations, his philosophical speculations, but he describes how he emerged from a sinful quasi-pagan. His father was a typical Roman pagan, his mother was a devout Catholic, and he eventually sided with his mother's worldview and became a saint, a priest, and then a saint in the Catholic Church. So he's analyzing in this section of the Confessions the first verse of the Bible, the first verse of the book of Genesis. And we'll see that he describes the cosmic horizon, the outermost sphere of the universe, as the heaven of heaven, and it contains all of the information of describing the past, the present, and the future of the universe. So here's a quote from the first verse of the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And the earth was void and empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the waters." So St. Augustine is going to make an issue of this word, the beginning. In Genesis, the author goes on to describe what happens on the first day of creation, the second day of creation, and so on up to the seventh day of creation. But here in the first verse, there's no specific day ascribed to these events. It's given this more abstract concept of the beginning. And St. Augustine speculates it's because it occurred before time was created, and he's going to equate the heaven of this first verse with what he calls the heaven of heaven. And the earth isn't planet Earth, it's the potential for matter to emerge. So when he talks about the face of the deep and God's Spirit moving over these waters, it's the waters of potential material reality. So I see it plausible to equate those waters with the ocean of waves of probability, or the quantum vacuum, from which all of the holographic illusions of material objects that we perceive arise. And the Spirit of God, I'm equating with the omnicentric singularity, which exists at each point of the infinitely energetic quantum vacuum, which is, according to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, equivalent to the cosmic horizon, which also contains the omnicentric singularity at each of its points. So continuing with the slide. In his Confessions, Augustine explains why no specific day of creation is assigned to the creation of heaven and earth in the first verse of Genesis, just the vague concept of in the beginning. So here's his explanation. "I assume that it is because by heaven is meant heaven of heaven, the intellectual heaven, where it is given to the intellect to know in one act and not part by part, not to know now one thing, now another, but, as has been said, to know in one act without any succession of time." So the intellectual heaven, the outermost sphere of the universe, is an intellectual being wherein it is possible to know the past, the present, and the future simultaneously, in one act, without any succession of time. It's an important correlation with Susskind's description of the cosmic horizon as a holographic memory bank of the universe, and with Carl Jung's recollection of his near-death experience, wherein he sees the cosmic horizon as also interweaving the past, the present, and the future. Continuing with the Confessions, Augustine says, "Clearly the heaven of heaven which you made in the beginning is in some way an intellectual creature, although in no way co-eternal with you, the Trinity, it is yet a partaker in your eternity." So Catholic dogma and Christian dogma in general does not accept a co-eternal feminine element or feminine side of God. Although in the Catholic Church, Mary, the mother of Jesus, has many of those qualities, the Church itself is considered feminine. And here we see another feminine agent almost on the level of the masculine Trinity, but not quite. And it's the cosmic horizon, this mother substance, which is what Plato depicted Timaeus the astronomer calling it when he was talking to Socrates. Your pure city, our mother. Earlier we saw Plato describe the cosmic horizon as the mother and receptacle of all created and visible and in any way sensible things. That was in the Timaeus. According to Augustine, there was then a created wisdom, created before all things, the reasonable and intellectual mind of your pure city, our mother, which is above and is free and eternal in heaven. So this pure city of God, the cosmic mother, is an intellectual mind, which is very similar to the idea of information conservation at the cosmic horizon, and of the many near-death experience accounts wherein people describe the sense of all-embracing love out literally at the point of no return, the edge of the universe, to go beyond which preempts you from ever returning to your body. So continuing with Augustine's Confessions, he says, with you, he's talking to God, with you, ever indwelling and illuminating it, a pure mind, united in perfect harmony, in a binding union of peace with those holy spirits, the citizens of your city, which is in heaven, far above the heavens we see. So God is ever indwelling and illuminating the cosmic horizon. God I am equating with the omnicentric, infinitely potent gravitational singularity. Now the citizens of your city I equate with Plato's absolute ideas, Carl Jung's archetypes of the collective unconscious. If God is absolute and God is a person, the supreme person, then all of the ideas of God's mind also must have personalities. The idea of tree must nevertheless, being an absolute part of God, have some personality associated with it. And like the god of tree, or some kind of a angel representing the idea of tree. So it's just important to equate each of these points of Augustine's cosmology, which led the Western mind for 1,000 years, with the different points of Plato's cosmology, which is very similar to Susskind's holographic string theory. So again, I'm saying the Holy Spirits, they represent angels. Augustine discusses later in the Confessions. But I would also associate the angels or the demigods with the absolute ideas of God's creative mind. So continuing, the singularity is the idea of the good, or God, who is ever indwelling and illuminating each point of the cosmic horizon, where the past, present, and future of the material world are superimposed at each point, along with the eternal archetypes or ideas, each of which is a self-aware embodiment of a particular facet of God's absolute goodness, a fractal abyss enfolding the infinity of nuances encapsulated in and projecting from it to form the holographic movie of the three-dimensional world. Dante Alighieri, La Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy. Augustine's Platonic Christian cosmology held sway over the Western mind for over 1,000 years, culminating in the cultural imagination with the poetry of Dante Alighieri, 1265 to 1321. According to Richard Tarnas, Dante realized in his epic poem La Divina Commedia what was in effect the moral, religious, and cosmological paradigm of the medieval era. That's in the Passion of the Western Mind. In Dante's cosmology, Earth is the center of the universe, while the omnipresent God's throne rests in an omniscient and omnipotent point of light at the outermost sphere, which he calls the Empyrean. So here in this picture, the Divine Comedy is broken into three parts. hell, purgatory, and heaven, or the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. And it's Dante visiting these levels of the cosmos, and he's experiencing what people experience after they die, although he himself has not died. It's similar to the myth of at the end of the Republic, which is the near-death experience account of a soldier named The fact that Plato's cosmology was delivered by a near-death experience of a soldier named and that Dante's Divine Comedy is similar to a near-death experience. He returns from the land of the dead to tell mortals on Earth what the afterlife is like, lends credibility to my claim that we should accept Carl Jung's near-death experience as initiating a new age wherein psychology and physics can be synthesized back into the original paradigm provided by Plato in the Republic, which is the original curriculum for the original academy. Carl Jung's near-death experience, when combined with Suskind's holographic string theory, I argue provides the new worldview within which we can confidently perform our cosmic heroics for God. Dante, eternal light. So continuing here with the analysis of Dante's Divine Comedy, Robert Osserman, who earned his PhD in mathematics from Harvard and formerly served as chair of the Department of Mathematics at Suskind's own Stanford University, explains that the Big Bang occupies the position where Dante placed a point of light radiating with great intensity. So that's the Empyrean. It's a point of infinite power at the outermost sphere of the universe. And I'll read a little bit more about the mathematics of this Empyrean in a moment, but continuing with describing his prolonged vision of this eternal light, Dante says, "In its depths I saw that it contained, bound by love in one volume, that which is scattered in leaves through the universe." So the entire trajectory of the universe, every bit of information describing the past, the present, and the future is contained in this single point of eternal light, which is obviously similar to the idea of the gravitational singularity, which contains all of the universes in the multiverse, the past, the present, and the future of each of them. So Dante goes on to say that once one gazes at this eternal point of light, it is impossible to look away willingly, for the good, which is the object of the will, is all gathered in it. It is the idea of the good. It is God, a point of infinite light, described by Plato in the cave allegory, which was fused with Christianity by St. Augustine, and that fusion culminated with Dante's Divine Comedy, and especially in the last section called Paradiso, which describes his rising up to the highest level of the cosmos. So now I want to read a little bit more. First I'll read a little bit more of what Dante said about looking at this eternal light. So this is quoted from Richard Tarnas's other book, Cosmos and Psyche. "O abounding grace, by which I dared to fix my look on the eternal light so long that I spent all my sight upon it. In its depths I saw that it contained, bound by love in one volume, that which is scattered in leaves through the universe, substances and accidents and their relations as it were fused together in such a way that what I tell of is a simple light. I think I saw the universal form of this complex, because in telling of it I feel my joy expand. Thus my mind, all rapt, was gazing, fixed, still and intent, and ever enkindled with gazing at that light. One becomes such that it is impossible for him ever to consent that he should turn from it to another sight, for the good which is the object of the will is all gathered in it." So a simple light, a single point, a point of infinite light that contains all knowledge in the cosmos and all love. Once you look at it, once you open the eye of the soul to this idea of the good, it is impossible to look away from it willingly, because every object of desire that you could possibly imagine is contained within it. So now I'll read a little bit more about the mathematics of this point of eternal light, which Robert Osserman said corresponds to the Big Bang. So at every point of the cosmic horizon, we have the gravitational singularity, because if every point contains the past, present, and the future, that equals a singularity. And now we'll read from the mathematician Rudy Rucker, who agrees with what Osserman says, and he says, to see why this is so, to see why the Big Bang exists at this outermost point of the cosmos, consider the fact that if space is hyperspherical, then one can cover all of space by starting at any point and letting a sphere expand outwards from that point. So a hypersphere is a higher dimensional sphere. Instead of the two-dimensional sphere, which is the surface of a three-dimensional ball, it would be a three-dimensional sphere in a four-dimensional space-time, which is similar to what we read about earlier, and all of the philosophers of the Middle Ages called God the sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. It's also equivalent to the Riemann sphere, which was the mathematical model of the complex number plane rolled into a sphere with a point representing infinity at the North Pole. Einstein used that mathematical model to express his theory of gravity, which is general relativity. So, continuing here, the curious thing, says Rudy Rucker, is that if one lets a sphere expand in hyperspherical space, there comes a time when the circumference of the sphere turns into a point and disappears. This fact can be grasped by considering the analogous situation of the sequence of circular latitude lines on the spherical surface of the Earth. This line of thought appears in Dante's Paradiso. Beyond the 9 spheres of angels lies a point called the Empyrean, which is the abode of God. The puzzling thing about Dante's cosmos is that here the Empyrean appears not to be a point, but rather to be all of space, except for the interior of the last sphere of angels, but this can be remedied if we take space to be hyperspherical. So the point of bringing that up is that this ultimate cosmology of the Middle Ages is consistent with our current cosmology based on Einstein's theory of general relativity, which is modeled on the Riemann sphere, which helps us describe the mathematics of higher dimensional spheres. Again, the Riemann sphere is the complex number plane consisting of real numbers and square roots of negative numbers or imaginary numbers rolled into a sphere with a point representing infinity, so that you can then multiply complex numbers. We discussed that previously, but it's just notable that the mathematical model of the number 1, the most complete model of the number 1, which includes its own negative, -1, and the square roots of its negative, that mathematical model of the 1 perfectly correlates to Einstein's theory of gravity, and it also correlates to Dante's cosmology, with the point at infinity representing the abode of God, the Empyrean, which is equivalent to a gravitational singularity. I hope you are enjoying this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. You can also click the link to my website, psycheandsingularity.com, to sign up for a multiple choice test with over 100 well-crafted questions related to this class, and links to the specific parts of each video where the answers can be found. If you take that test to the end, you will receive a certificate indicating that you have become a Psyche and Singularity scholar. In addition to access to that test, there is also the opportunity to answer essay questions that ask you to relate concepts covered in this class to your own hero's journey. I will personally respond to each of those essays, point out any other parts of this class that I think might bolster your plan. Finally, I want to point out that this course is sponsored by the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being, and you can check those guys out at divineinfinitebeing.com.